Good morning. I'm Jim Mason, Vice President of Litigation at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and it's my pleasure this morning to welcome Dr. Peter Gray. Dr. Gray is a research professor and longtime professor at Boston College, and he's the author of an excellent book, Free to Learn, as well as he's president of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education and a founding member of Let Grow, two organizations that I think you folks out there will find to be very interesting. How are you this morning, Dr. Gray?
I'm fine. Thank you.
You and yours doing okay in all this coronavirus world?
We are, thank goodness, yes.
Very good. And you're in from Framingham, Mass today?
No, I live in, I once lived in Framingham. I live in Millis, Massachusetts now.
Oh, okay. So if you're listening out there and you'd like to make some comments or ask some questions as we go along, go ahead and put them into the comments and I'll try to get to them. And we'd love to hear where you're listening from today. So if you want to just let us know you're out there, we'd really like that. So Peter, you came to my attention recently because of the article you wrote in Psychology Today, where you are a regular blogger, the case against homeschooling. So Professor Bartholet of Harvard University has written a law review article that's gotten quite a bit of response. And I just wanted to note that you have, in the first little section of your response to her, 3 one-word sentences: ouch, yikes, and oi. That's succinct writing. We appreciate that. So, Dr. Gray, before we get into that article, I'd like you to explain to our folks the organizations that you're affiliated with, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education and Let Grow.
Yeah, well, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education is, as the name implies, it's an alliance. We're trying to bring people together who are in favor of self-directed education for children. I have long been conducting research on how children learn when they're allowed to learn in the way that nature intended, when they're allowed to follow their own curiosity, when they're allowed to play fully, when they're allowed to socialize to the degree that they want to do. I've become convinced that children, through my research, that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves, and that the job of us adults is to provide the conditions that allow them to do that. And that's a big job. I don't want to minimize the role of adults. But as part of my research, I did a study many years ago of the graduates of a remarkably alternative school called the Sudbury Valley School, which is in Framingham, Massachusetts, where my son actually was a student many years ago. And because it's so different, I was concerned as to whether he was going to be okay as an adult. And that motivated me to do a study of the graduates. This was decades ago. And that study of the graduates. So here, I mean, this is a school where children are just playing and exploring, following their own interests. There's no required courses, no courses even offered. Kids, if they want to get together and form a course, can do it. It's as different from a traditional school as you can imagine. And the kids come from a variety of backgrounds. Most of them come from public school. They're not a private school group for the most part. It's kind of a mix of middle class and working class people whose kids go there, and many of them are kids who were not doing well in public school. So I did this study of graduates, and it really turned my life around. They were doing very well in the world. They were getting into college if they wanted to go to college, even if they had never taken a course before, never taken a test until they took the SAT, if they needed to take that to apply to the college they wanted to go to. And so then I got really interested in how they're learning, and I began to do a wide range of research on that. So that study led me to then, as I mentioned, to do a lot of other research on children children's learning, and then it became once you see the light on this, it's hard not to become an advocate for it. It's like there are a lot of children. I'm not saying every child in the traditional school system is suffering, but a lot of them are. And and what I can see is for those children who leave that system and who go into a system of self-directed education, they do well. And so then I subsequently did a study more recently of grown unschoolers. So these are people who are homeschooling officially, but they're not doing school at home. They are providing support. The families are providing support for the children's own self-directed interests. And once again, I found that the young people who had actually some of them were middle-aged, they're not all young adults, who had been unschooled, were doing well in life. So so that motivated me, and by this time I was connected with a number of other people who for years have been involved in self-directed education movement to help form the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. And our mission at the Alliance is to make this route to education more possible for more people. Right now, you have to be in a position where you could homeschool your children, and although many people are in that position, not everybody is. Or you have to pay for enrolling your child in a school like Sudbury Valley. The tuition is very cheap compared to other private schools, but it's still something. And so we're working on various ways of making it more possible for more people who would elect to choose this route to education for their children to do so. We're also trying to make the results of the research, the fact that many people are doing this, growing number of people are doing this, more publicly known. Most people today, of course, have heard of homeschooling. Mm-hmm. But still, unschooling or self-directed education, these are strange terms for the majority of people. And it sounds to people like the family has made a decision that their children are not going to be educated. And we have to draw a distinction between schooling and education. Schooling is one thing, education is another thing.
Now you go into that in your book quite extensively in the chapter "Why Schools Are What They Are." I'd love to hear your kind of the transformation that you see from the way why schools are the way they are to the way you think children learn best.
So why schools are the way they are, it's interesting. So a lot of people who write about the origin of schools, especially people who write about it from the kind of viewpoints similar to mine, who are critical of schools, talk about schools as originating in kind of the industrial age, and schools are built on the factory model, and the idea that children are going through an assembly line and you're adding a bit of knowledge in first grade and second grade and third grade and so on, and ultimately at the end of the assembly line you've got a finished product, an educated person, kind of the model of schooling. And there's some truth to that, because age-graded schooling sort of was associated with that period of time. By that time, when schools became state-run and compulsory. But the real origin of the kind of school that we have today came out of the Protestant Reformation. Particularly in Prussia. Prussia was ahead of the rest of the world. The German, what is now mostly Germany, was ahead of the rest of the world in the development of church-run schools. And the primary purpose of those schools, there were several purposes, but one was because the Protestants, unlike the Catholics, believed that it's important for every human being to read the Bible directly rather than to get the message indirectly from priests or through a church hierarchy. They believed it was important for people to be able to read. And so part of the purpose of these early Protestant schools was to teach reading. But even more than reading, even more than that, was a belief that it was very important for everybody to believe the Bible. And secondly, that it was that obedience was extremely important. And so the schools were developed really to teach reading, to teach Bible doctrine, and to teach obedience. And if you read, which I did, some of the original writing of the people who formed these schools in the 17th century, beginning the 17th and into the 18th century, um, obedience was the primary purpose. The people in charge of the schools would write in their manuals, so it's fine if you're enlightening the children and so on, but keep in mind that the primary purpose is to shape the child's will. And that really meant obedience training. There was, of course, the belief at that time that we are born in sin, and that the sinfulness has to be kind of beaten out of children in order to get them to obey. So obedience and indoctrination were the primary purposes of those original schools. Well, eventually those schools were taken over by the state as the power of religion declined. And by the way, the same thing happened in the United States, in America, in the colonies, where you had, and especially in Massachusetts, there were Protestant-run schools that were very similar. They were actually modeled after the schools in Prussia. And so, but eventually these schools were taken over by the state as the power of religion declined and the power of states increased. And then the message became secular rather than religious, but the purpose of indoctrination, now it was sort of nationalistic indoctrination, and obedience training remained. And you read the original writings of people who were for compulsory education at that time, a lot of it was around that. We needed to, especially in America, we were a nation of immigrants. It was very important. People were worried about rebellion. People were worried about people coming with different ideas and so on and so forth. And schools were to indoctrinate people so that everybody became a quote, American. And that played a big role in the compulsory education laws. So by the middle of the 19th century, we had compulsory education in Massachusetts. By fairly early in the 20th century, we had compulsory state education throughout the United States. But the schools, if you were to go back and look at those original schools, you would recognize them as schools. Children sitting in rows, children being given lessons that they're supposed to memorize and feed back to the teacher. So that was really the original origin of schools. So one of the things that I often argue is that schools developed for the purpose of indoctrination and obedience training. They were designed for that. You wouldn't design a school the way schools are designed if that wasn't your purpose. You just wouldn't do it that way. If your purpose was to teach critical thinking, if your purpose was to teach a real love of learning, if your purpose was creativity, no way would you design a school system where the methodology is to give everybody the same information and expect them to feed it back to you on a test. That's just ridiculous in terms of those kinds of goals. So my argument is that our schools today make sense from this historical perspective. And it's a historical perspective that's the opposite of self-directed education. It's the opposite of what, even people who go into teaching in our public school system, most of them they love children, and they'll say that they want to go into teaching because they want to foster a love of education, they want to foster creativity, they want to foster critical thinking, and so on and so forth. But they're entering a system that was not designed for that. And so there they are, they're frustrated, and they soon find themselves as taskmasters, even if that's not what they want to be. So
that brings us to let's move up to the late second half of the 20th century and the emergence of what we call homeschooling, and some unschooling started back then too. How revolutionary is that, and what what difference is it going to make in the lives of kids?
Yes, well, it's revolutionary when you think of it in modern times. It's not revolutionary if you think of it more long-term historically. I mean, most kids were homeschooled before we had compulsory schooling, right? Or before we had, And the truth of the matter is, I mean, people think we'd all be illiterate if we didn't have compulsory schooling, but most people were literate before we had compulsory schooling. People learned if you grew up in a family that reads and writes, you're going to read and write. Even slaves were learning to read, even though it was forbidden to teach slaves to read. Many of them learned to read. They figured, they snuck learning how to read. It's not that difficult. So the kinds of things we worry that would happen if we didn't have these compulsory schools, we know it wouldn't happen because homeschooling seemed to take care of that before. If you've got a whole group of people who are not literate, then they're not going to learn to read at home if their parents aren't literate. But if your parents are literate, you'll learn to read. And so it is important in some cases that opportunities to learn how to read be provided to people for whom it's not automatically going to occur because they're in a literate home. So that, but it's interesting. I'm not as close probably as you are. I'm sure I'm not to the origin of homeschooling and the struggles to make homeschooling legal and so on and so forth. I've come sort of somewhat late to an understanding of homeschooling. But the idea that school is so important for children, there's so much, we hear that all the time, and we are now pretty much at least third generation schooled. So it's hard for most people to imagine that somebody could grow up well without going to school, right? We went to school, our parents went to school, chances are our grandparents went to school. This is what people do. The first thing you ask about any child is, what grade are you in, or what's your favorite subject? Kids hate this question, by the way, but that's the way we look at children. We look at their development that way. So it's a pretty radical step for anybody to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to send my child to this institution that everybody thinks is so important, that most people think is so important. And it's even more radical if you say, and I'm also not going to do that at home. I'm not going to call my child a first grader or a second grader. I'm not going to give them a first grade or a second grade curriculum. I'm going to let them follow their own interests. I'm going to trust that they're going to learn how to read and write, and that they're going to learn the things that they need to know to be successful in this life. That's a pretty radical statement for a person to make.
That's a very radical statement. And as somebody who has homeschooled my kids for like 27 years, and my 17-year-old is the last of my batch. But the legal part of it was kind of interesting because, my experience is similar to yours. I came to homeschooling a little bit reluctantly, kind of kicking and screaming by my wife, dragging me into it, and then discovered that, wait a second, this actually works. And once my kids learned how to read, it was amazing. They actually liked it, and they liked to learn things. But we had to teach them when they're in the line at the grocery store, when people ask them, so where do you go to school? Not to say, oh, I don't go to school. And there is sort of a worldview out there that even today, I mean, I think homeschooling and unschooling is far more mainstream than it was when I first started. But there is a bit of an educational curve to get the rest of the world thinking about it, which brings me to an interesting question. Today, everybody has their kids at home, and they're being introduced to this concept of being with their kids and either trying to reproduce, bells and whistles and columns and rows at home, or letting their kids just learn. What do you have to say to the folks out there today that maybe are the first time considering that maybe they could do this for their own kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me work into that by saying, you mentioned that I'm involved with another organization called Let Grow, and actually through Let Grow, we're doing a study. We'll soon be publishing it, of how families are coping. Families that have had kids in school, how they're coping, how the kids are coping. A very large survey. As a little bit of a preliminary on Let Grow, I'm in Alliance for Self-Directed Education. I'm working to help people who are leaving school.
Hmm.
But in Let Grow, we're working with schools to try to make school a more pleasant place, to bring more play back into school. So much play. Recess has been almost cut out for so many schools. Standardized testing has taken away almost all the creative activities out of many schools. Children are more and more there to prepare for tests, and there's less and less of the writing poems and stories and doing art and the kind of creative and fun things that kids used to enjoy in school. So we've been working with schools to loosen them up, to bring more play into schools with some success with the schools that have been working with us. But now that school is closed, we have been focusing on what's happening to the kids out of school, and so we actually engaged a market research company to do the research, because they have the means of doing it, and there are several hundred people surveyed across social class, and the survey involves questions both to the parents and to the children. We chose to survey families that had children between the age of 8 and 13. And the questions were about how the parents are coping, how the children are coping, and so on and so forth. And what we have found, interestingly, is that they're on average, not in every case by any means, and we know there are some awful situations that are occurring as a result of the pandemic, not just the disease, but awful situations due to job loss, due to not every family, as you know, there are families where you want to get away from the family, right? And there are kids who need to get away from the family. So I don't want to say that this is across the board, but the majority of the respondents were saying that their kids are happier now than when they were in school. Their kids are calmer now. And most interestingly, what the parents are saying is, I'm becoming impressed by my kids. I'm learning some things about my kids that I didn't really have the opportunity to observe before. This is especially true in the kinds of families that are very achievement-oriented families, and they're basically, their job is to take their kids to one activity after another, right? So the kids are in school, they're doing homework, they're going from one activity to another. Well, now, not only is school closed, but all those after school activities are closed. So the kids are home. And we think of boredom as a bad word, but boredom is what stirs the soul, right? I mean, the kids are bored. And what do you do when you're bored? You figure out what to do. You find something to do. That means you're taking initiative. And so we're hearing from families where they'll say things like, my son had a guitar that he's had for several years, and he's never had time to play it. And isn't it interesting? He's now playing this guitar, and he's enjoying the guitar. We've heard from many families where children are first learning how to ride a bicycle for the first time because they've got time to ride a bicycle. They want to ride a bicycle. We are hearing from families that said, I never believed that my child would be capable of cooking, but my child wants to cook. So the children are, there's nothing else to do. So they want to do these things, and then they're proud of themselves that they can cook a meal. An 8-year-old or 9-year-old can cook a meal, and the parents are proud of this. So what's happened is we've stepped back a little bit in time to a somewhat interestingly, we call this abnormal times, but in some sense, we've stepped back to something that's more normal, which is that you've got time. You've got time to be bored. You've got time to daydream. You've got time for the kids, time to lie out in the spring sunshine and enjoy the weather and watch the insects in the ground. We're hearing about these things. People are rediscovering childhood. People are rediscovering that children are much more competent than they thought they were, and that children thrive when they have opportunity to take self-initiative. So what we're seeing is people are getting a hint at what self-directed education is like, where children are not being governed by adults all the time. The parents are, even those who are doing the curriculum at home, the school curriculum at home, as one parent said, my children can do the curriculum in 2 hours, and it doesn't take 6 hours in the school day. They can do the whole thing in 2 hours, and then they've got the rest of the time to pursue their own interests. This, by the way, is something I've often heard from homeschoolers. It's not just people who call themselves unschoolers, but homeschoolers say, the curriculum doesn't take the amount of time that school takes. They can go through that whole curriculum. They can learn the same things that even those who are just doing the regular school curriculum as homeschooling, they can do it in much less time. And then they've still got most of their life for self-directed education, right? So I think people are discovering that. I've even heard from a few parents who say, I'm not sure I'm going to send my child back to school. So I think that there will be an increase in homeschooling once schools open. I think there will be, probably these are mostly families that were already on the verge of homeschooling. They were thinking about it, but they weren't sure. It seemed like a radical movement to them. And now they've had a chance to test it a little bit, and they see that it's working pretty well for them. And they're thinking, well, maybe I'll stay with it now.
There's nothing really quite the same as the joy of seeing a child grow and learn and develop. I remember distinctly one of my kids had a hard time reading, learning how to read. And then all of a sudden, it just all clicked. And to be there and to see that happen, and then to see how his interests developed from learning to read and then going into a different, pursuing his own interests, it's just a blessing and a joy to be present for all that. So talk a little bit more about Let Grow. Our mutual friend Lenore Skenazy, I think, is the president of that organization. We've met a few times and talked about things. Why is it so important for kids to be able to play more and to have more independence, and for neighbors to actually allow kids to kind of roam around and pursue their own destinies a bit?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that what you've just described of children playing more, getting around more, free range kids. This is normal childhood. This has always been normal childhood. This is not, this is the way, except for times of child slavery or intense child labor. There's never been a time until recently in our culture. There's never been a time where children were not free to do those things. But what's happened in the United States and much of the rest of the industrialized post-industrial world, the same thing is happening. We have been gradually taking children's freedom away. So over the last at least 50 years, we've been gradually removing children's freedom from them. In fact, it's longer than 50 years. The historians of play suggest that it was really beginning around 1955 or 1960 that that we began to, in various ways, encroach upon children's freedom to play and explore, and that it's been ever since then a continuous decline in children's freedom. We've increased the weight of schooling, the amount of time they spend in school. Children now have 5 weeks more of school during the school year than children did when I was in school in the 1950s. We've increased the length of the school day. We've increased homework tremendously, especially in elementary school. There didn't used to have homework in elementary school. We've taken away recess. So school has become increasingly weighty, increasingly time-consuming. And as part of this kind of movement towards more and more schooling, we've also developed the attitude that children's own activities are kind of a waste of time, and that children are accomplishing more if they're doing something that's adult-directed. So even when children are not in school, we tend to put them in adult-directed sports and various kinds of clubs and so on, where there's an adult in charge. and in the belief that they're learning more because there's an adult than they would learn if they're out creating their own activities, solving their own problems, and so on and so forth. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is partly because of the media playing up everything that happens if a child is assaulted or kidnapped. Whenever that occurs, we all hear about it. We don't recognize that this is extremely rare that this occurs. These are very, very, very uncommon. They've always been uncommon. They're less common even today than ever before. But we've come to believe that it's really dangerous for kids to be out there without an adult watching them and supervising them all the time. This is something that simply wasn't true when I was a kid. Kids by the age of 5, I could go anywhere in town on my bicycle. Admittedly, that was a small town, but my late first wife lived in Brooklyn, New York, and she couldn't go anywhere in Brooklyn, but she could certainly go out and play in the street and in the neighborhood without adults watching her when she was 5 or 6 years old. This was just common, and this is the way that children have been throughout history, through most of the world. A lot of their time is with other kids away from adults, and that's how they learn to become adults, because when there's no adult there watching you and guarding you and solving your problems, you've got to figure all those things out yourself, and that's how you learn to take responsibility for yourself. It's how you learn to negotiate with your peers. It's how you learn to create your own activities. It's basically how you learn to become an independent person, which is the whole purpose of childhood, is to become increasingly independent, to be able to take charge of your own life. But if we don't allow children to take charge of their own life, they don't learn that. And we've got the evidence that children are not learning that to the degree that they did in the past. We're also seeing record levels of depression, of anxiety, of suicide. And in my book, Free to Learn, and some of my academic articles, I've drawn the cause-effect relationship. I'm absolutely convinced that because we have deprived children of play, because we have put them into ever more adult-directed, adult-judged activities, we are creating the conditions that are producing depression and anxiety. And we're seeing that at record levels. Interestingly, another thing that we found in this study of kids off from school and off from these other activities is that the parents are saying their kids are less stressed than before. I've also documented, I've written articles pointing out that the rate of suicide among school-age children is twice as high during the school year as it is during the summer. For people who are not in school, there's no relationship between the season and suicide. So this is, and there was also a study conducted by the American Psychological Association about 4 years ago called Stress in America. And they found that school-age teenagers are the most stressed out people in America, more so than adults. And 83% of them attributed their stress to school. And when they did this survey in the summer, when they were not in school, they found the number who reported that they had felt severe stress during the past week was less than half what it was when they did it during the school year. So there's no question but school is causing high levels of anxiety, high levels of stress, and is a contributing factor to suicide. So when parents take their children out of school because they are claiming that school isn't safe for their children, there's some reason why they're doing that. They are seeing that their child is stressed out, as many, many children are. And they're rescuing their child from that. That's the common course. We did a study a few years ago of unschooling families, and the typical unschooling family starts off, at least with their first child, in public school, and they see that something unhealthy is happening to that child. The child is losing their love of learning, not gaining a love of learning. The child is coming home angry, and this child who wasn't angry before is coming home angry. The child is losing an interest in this bright child who before school had all these interests and was learning is now suddenly coming home and just vegging out because of school. And they say, that's not my child. There's something, and so they take the child out of school thinking they'll homeschool, and they homeschool, and of course many of them continue homeschooling. But some of them, they start homeschooling and they say, so I'm giving my child these lessons, this boxed curriculum, and so whatever it is, and my child is kind of bored with it, and what I'm seeing is my child wants to read these other books, and these other books seem just as interesting and educational to me as the books and the curriculum, so why should I insist on the books and the curriculum? So they gradually become unschoolers on the basis of seeing their children flourish when their children are doing what they want to do rather than doing what they're being required to do.
Well, I'm sort of alarmed by what you're saying. Are you saying that that shoving kids like 30 into a classroom and then force feeding them all the same thing at the same speed for 13 years is less effective than letting the kids kind of self-direct their education with a relaxed family approach to learning that allows them to pursue their interests? I mean, is that what you're trying to say? I don't buy it.
Of course you buy it.
I'm selling it. What do you mean?
especially when you put it in those terms. What's surprising to me is that why isn't it obvious to everyone that this isn't a reasonable approach to education? You know what we have, one way of looking at it is this. We have the idea that education is like a track. You're running along a track, and everybody is going on the same track, and everybody is in competition with everybody else on this track. All the same measures. Everybody's being measured by the same thing. It's like it's a race. We even use that terminology, no child left behind. It's like it's a race, and some children are going to be behind and some are ahead, and we want to make sure we push the ones who are behind so they're not behind anymore. Race to the top, even a worse metaphor, right? I mean, top of what? And why is this a race? Is education really a race, or is it more like a ramble in the park? Or, what would be the metaphor? So I think of education as sort of like a bush or a tree. And we're not all on the same track. One person is going out on this limb and somebody else is going out on this limb, depending on what their interests are. The amount of knowledge and the number of different skills that are important in our culture today increases exponentially. It's huge. Now, no person can learn more than a tiny sliver of it, right? So why should everybody be learning the same sliver? Isn't it better off if we have diversity, if we have some people who are interested in this and they really become good at that and passionate about that, and other people become interested in this and they become good at that's what we see in self-directed education. Everybody learns to read. Absolutely. Even those who are diagnosed with dyslexia when they're in public school, when they go into self-directed education, they learn to read. There may be a few exceptions, but 95% of them, even with that diagnosis, learn to read. We don't have to worry that they're not going to learn to read. If they're in a literate society, they're going to learn to read. They're going to learn to use numbers to the degree that they need numbers in whatever it is that they're doing. We're surrounded by numbers. Kids are learning numbers all the time when they're playing games, when they're cooking in the kitchen, when they're cutting boards, when they're painting their room, they're working with numbers and they're learning numbers in a real way that is meaningful. The math that we teach in school I'll ask adults, even scientists, I'll ask them, so did you study quadratic equations when you were in high school? And so tell me, what's a quadratic equation? They don't know. Even the scientists don't. Why did everybody have to learn quadratic equations? It's not that it builds the mind, because all they did was memorize a solution for manipulating quadratic equations. Even the teachers don't know what it's for or understand it fully. It's just being taught as something to memorize, and yet it's sort of the ritual to have to do that. Well, isn't it much more interesting if we allow people to pursue what they're really interested in, and then they get deeply into it, and their mind really does grow because if you're self-directed about it, you really want to understand it. You really want to know it. You've got a reason, either because of curiosity or because something that you want to do requires that you know this. You really want to understand it. So there's no learning is so much more rapid and more deep when you are learning what you have decided you want to learn.
So I think you have said a lot of things that are going to, there's a word of hope for a lot of people out there homeschooling. And here's why I say that. Over the years, I've become acquainted with a number of homeschooling families who feel the pressure of kind of having a regimented school at home. And many state homeschooling laws require, 6 hours of daily education. And most homeschooling families learn what you said, that, well, my kids can get through the daily dose of formal education much faster than 6 hours, but they have to document 6 hours, and just the pressure of that some kids don't learn at the same pace, some kids don't have the same abilities in the same ways, and so for the folks out there, there's a lot of hope in what you say, that you can actually focus on each of your kids and let them pursue their own interests and learn at their own pace, and not worry about comparing them in the race to the top or the No Child Left Behind kind of sense. Anything else you'd like to say about either Let Grow or Self-Directed Education Alliance before we go?
Well, I might just build on a point that you just made, that I've in my research on unschooling families, there are families that will say, okay, so I had one of my children learned how to read at age 4, and another of my children didn't learn how to read until she was 12.
Mm-hmm.
She does the one who learned to read at age 12 did all kinds of interesting things. She just didn't do things that involved reading. She was developing all kinds of other abilities, but at age 12, she reached the point finally where she realized that to pursue what she really wanted to do at this point, she needed to read. And so she learned how to read. She learned how to read very quickly. And now that 4 years more has passed since that time, you wouldn't be able to tell which one learned to read
Right.
early and which one learned to. I've heard those kinds of stories over and over. And I actually did a study, a somewhat informal study of learning to read. And Harriet Pattison in the UK has done a more formal study of homeschoolers learning to read. And they learn at all wide range of ages. Usually people talk about this in terms of brain development. I don't think it has anything to do with brain development. I think it has to do with interest. I think it has to do with engagement. Kids get engaged with things. So my son could read he could read well by the time he was 4. And I don't think it's because his brain was that different from anybody else's. I think he was growing up in the family. I was a graduate student. I was reading all the time. His mom was a big reader. He looked around and he said, well, reading seems to be what people do around here. And he taught himself to read. I would carry him around in a backpack. We lived in New York City at the time. It was the easiest way to get around. And so he could see whatever I could see. And he would point to signs and he'd say, what's that say? So we didn't deliberately teach him to read. We just answered his questions. And so, his first word was exit. And pretty soon he was reading everything. And, but it was he had decided he needed to learn to read because that's what people do. Now, two kids in the same family, even exposed to the same amount of reading in the family and so on, for one reason or another, it's a mystery how interests develop. One reason or another, some kids get interested in reading early on and some later. But eventually, in this society where we're surrounded by the written word, you cannot grow up without at some point realizing that it's important to learn how to read. And when that's important, you learn how to read. And the other thing we found in these studies is at whatever age you learn how to read, it's not all that difficult. So just to take reading, because that's something that people are concerned about. So your point about trying to follow a curriculum, trying to test. So if you're trying to follow a curriculum and you're concerned that the government is going to take away your ability to homeschool your kids if they don't pass certain tests at certain times, well, then you're going to want to insist that that child learn to read on schedule, because the whole test depends upon being
Right.
able to read, right? You're going to completely fail that test if you can't read the questions. So that's you know there so then that becomes, and then that spoils the unschooling, because it's no longer unschooling. Now you're making your child to read, and your child is going to resist reading, and your child is going to grow up with some, and not every child, but many children, when they're forced to learn how to read, they don't like to read. They develop a dislike of reading. I think, generally speaking, homeschoolers, unschoolers are big readers, and I think it's because most of them learn to read in their own way, in their own time, and as a consequence, they don't have negative associations with reading. It's not, they've never been shamed for not being able to read.
Mm.
So reading is just one realm, but it's an important realm, because it's probably, if a child can't read, it's probably the main thing that's going to lead somebody, some school investigator, to say, well, this child has been neglected because they haven't learned how to read by
Right.
age 6 or 7 or whatever
Right.
the age is.
Right. Well, I've dealt with that a few times in the last 20 years working at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and we've learned a lot about how kids develop and how they grow. And we have expert witnesses that come at it kind of like you, and go into court and say, well, this kid is doing as well as he needs to be doing. It's not right to compare him with the cohort of 7-year-olds. This child, is doing fine for him, for his age and his group, and his mom. This is an amazing thing I've learned over the years, is that most moms, especially, in my world, it's mostly moms who are doing the homeschooling. They have a way of discerning, without any formal education, the learning methods that work best for each of their children. And they sort of naturally kind of find their way to it. And I imagine it's a lot of it has to do with the children probably find their way to it and the moms go along with it. And some kids learn better by reading, some by hearing, some by manipulating. And then large doses of that free time that you're talking about to pursue their own interests. It's amazing how the education establishment says, if you don't have a teaching certificate, you can't figure that out. But in my experience, they do.
Yeah, that of course fits perfectly with my point of view about self-directed education. It's really the children who figure it out, and the parents, if they're attuned to their children, follow suit. You naturally know. Think of all that children learn. I used to be able to say this without qualification. Think of all that children learn before the age of 5, before anybody tries to systematically teach them anything. Of course, nowadays people are trying to systematically teach them even before the age of 5, which is interfering with their natural learning. But they learn their whole native language from scratch. They learn a huge amount about the world around them. They're just little learning machines. We don't need to motivate them to learn. We just have to let them learn. We just have to get out of their way and provide, be there to answer their questions and provide help with what they're looking for. But the idea that you have to motivate, a lot of education school is how to motivate children. Well, have you ever seen a 3-year-old who's not motivated to learn, right? They're not motivated to do exactly what you want them to do. Right. That's where I say that schools are more about obedience training than about actual learning of anything else.
Well, Dr. Gray, this has been wonderful. I'm getting some comments here. I didn't get any questions, but I got a lot of comments from listeners saying how encouraging what you've had to say has been for them. And I think a lot of people today who are experiencing what you're saying, the study that you did with the kids that are home now unexpectedly, are going to see that joy of watching their kids grow and consider what you've said today and make that choice. I just want to say, free to learn, it's a great book. It's got a lot of historical and research in it that homeschoolers and anybody that is interested in this topic will find extremely interesting. So, Dr. Gray, Peter, thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed this conversation and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Jim. I also hope we talk again soon. And thank you for all the work you've done to make homeschooling possible.
Oh, well, thank you. Did you look that up? That's our tagline. Yay.
Yeah.
So for HSLDA, I am Jim Mason, and we do exist here to help all of you out there make homeschooling possible for you and your family. Thanks again to my guest, Dr. Peter Gray.